The Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation presents Our Story, hosted by the Foundation's chairman and president, Jason Villalba. Each week on Our Story, hear the personal and intimate stories of Hispanics all across Texas, told in their own voices. Our Story provides insight into a community of people who are literally and figuratively changing the complexion of the United States. This is who we are.
Welcome back to the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation's Our Story. Every week, we bring somebody interesting in to tell about their story from their voice. Today, I have my very favorite guest that I've ever had, none other than my own mom. My mother's story is fascinating. She comes from such a unique background that I wanted people to hear her story in her words. My mother, of course, shaped the person that I am, and she is so important in my life, and I'm just thankful for her and thankful for what she represents to me. And her story, I think, is one that you will find quite compelling. Welcome to our show. Welcome to Our Story, Naomi Villalba, my mom. I'm going to call you Mom for this process, but welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me come and also for getting the opportunity to tell my story.
Well, it's going to be great to hear from you, just because I've known this story all of my life, and I know the details and the contours of it, but I've never really dug deep enough. And we're going to get to really learn from you what it was like to become an American citizen and to grow up and to really achieve some great things in this great, wonderful country of ours. But I want to start from the very, very beginning. What's your earliest memory?
My earliest memory was being with different families. One lady who liked to listen to the 1950s dinosaur type sounds, even though she was a Mexican woman. They were listening to American music.
This is in Mexico.
No, this is in America.
So
I don't even have a memory of Mexico.
You were born in Mexico.
Right.
In Chiapas?
In Oaxaca. Loma Bonita, Oaxaca, which is the second state before before getting into Guatemala. Chiapas is between that. So it's Oaxaca, Chiapas, and then Guatemala.
So you were born in Mexico, but you don't remember that time because you left that country at a very, very early age.
Yes, before memories are usually formed. So all I have memories of that are pictures of my father and my mother coming across, and I was in their arms.
Let's talk about your mother and your father. And of course, this year was devastating to our family, and you particularly. We lost Grandpa Morales. He was 97 years old when he passed. Obviously, he had grown up in Mexico. How did he meet your mom, my grandmother?
He came to the United States. He was in Mexico, and he met a woman that was in the Nazarene church in Mexico. And she gave him a Bible, and he learned to read the Bible and English, and then tried to use that English to also converse.
So the first person that he met in Mexico from America was a United States missionary.
That's correct.
And she was Nazarene.
And so this woman and other people in the organization, I guess, that knew her, began to work with this young man, and they saw his potential, and he also really loved God. So he wanted to learn more about the Bible and about being a minister and come back to Mexico and give that message to his homeland.
So this was in the 1940s. You had an Anglo female in Mexico who's proselytizing to essentially villagers in this area of Oaxaca. He must have been a Catholic growing up and yet converted.
Well, I don't know. He never ever said he was Catholic. I do think that his family must have been, because that's probably what they are in that part of the country. But he never, and I will say this, I think there was that thread there, because he definitely had a very different view of Catholicism than I did.
So he hears the good news,
right,
from the missionary, and he takes it in
Yeah.
and studies in Mexico. And he goes to the States. Now, why did he go to the States to proselytize? Because
Well, actually, he didn't go to proselytize. He went to go and learn more. He was accepted at a Nazarene college in Nashville, Tennessee.
so that's interesting. So it probably means, and again, we don't have the papers or documentation for this, but it probably means that he went to this, he got into the United States on an education visa and was able to be educated in the United States through the Nazarene Church.
Correct.
That's interesting. And do you know what he studied when he came to the
Oh,
States?
theology.
So theology.
Mhm,
And
theology. And then on the weekends, these young students would be asked to go into the different villages around Nashville and talk to the different churches, that mostly the youth and young people of these churches. And they were very rural and very out in the mountains of Nashville and hills. And it's if you go there, you can see the beauty of these backwards places in Tennessee. And
so it's a rural village in Tennessee in the 1940s. So we're not talking about a giant city. We're talking about countryside and Appalachian Mountains and
very near, very kind of like Appalachians, definitely under the state of Kentucky, because northern Tennessee is right under Kentucky, which is very, very Appalachia type.
And does he speak English at this point?
He speaks broken English, and he, continued on pursuing the English language through all this period of time. And he goes to this little church in Dover, Tennessee, and meets the Page family that were attending a little church there. They lived in Bumpus Mills, and they went to the church in Dover, which was in those days the bigger city. And so when they went there, he met Thela Mae Page.
Now, how does he meet? Is he giving a talk as a Nazarene college student about what it's like to live in another country? Is it a local sock hop? How do they
just
connect?
Were in church, and he begins to look at the white girl and gets interested. And so him, and she was like maybe 18 or 17, and he was a 26-year-old man. But he saw her, and they must have fallen madly in love.
Well, let's stop right there, because to me, this is one of the most fascinating points in the story. Here is a woman who's 17 in rural Tennessee, who's lily white. She's from Europe and Irish and German background, Irish, German, English.
Scottish, German, Ireland, the British Isles.
And my grandfather, your father, was from Mexico,
dark skin,
very Hispanic looking, Mexican looking, and she falls in love with him. That must have been scandalous at the time.
I asked that question later of my aunts and uncles, and it was not. They accepted him very easily. Maybe there were titters from the other members or something, and he was not aware of it. But that particular family embraced him with love. And my grandmother, she just loved my dad.
Well, think about the time, right? This is the 1940s. So they're probably in the Deep South still miscegenation laws, right? Laws that prohibit African Americans and Anglos from dating, much less marrying. And yet here's this dark-skinned Mexican man who was embraced by the community, by the church, and then ultimately by the family that he adopts in Dover, Tennessee. To me, that's amazing. We hear so many stories that are the other direction.
I think it was because of the love of God. I do think that love was involved in the way that they lived their lives, which was in a way that, okay, this is happening. We're going to love this man, and vice versa. He loved them, and they all became very close. In fact, after my mother married Albert, that was his name, then one of the other brothers, there was only one brother, he goes to marry a Mexican woman. He found another lady. So there was
one of Thelema's brothers.
One of Thelema,
so
the only brother.
So Thelema's only brother falls in love with the Mexican woman.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. So out of this family of very lily white people, two of them are married to Hispanics.
To Mexicans.
Mexicans. And so then they decide to go off to Mexico. She marries him.
Okay, so she marries him during this time. I just can't emphasize this enough. I think it speaks to the genuineness of the Christian community,
absolutely,
within which they were both a part, which they were both a part of. Because otherwise, in a nation that was as divided as ours was at the time with respect to that issue, for these two to get together and get married must have been unique. And so they get married, and they decide to travel back to Mexico. Was it back to Oaxaca?
It was. And they lived in Oaxaca. And I think they also went down to Chiapas, and they were doing also missionary work. And my mother began to speak Spanish like a native. I mean, she was totally immersed. And within a few months, because she was so young, she got the language extremely well. So
she becomes a missionary, much like the woman that my grandfather, your father, first met before he went to the United States. And so she starts doing that, and he helps her.
Yes. And then she gets pregnant with me, and we are there. I don't know how long it was.
So this is in the 1950s.
I was born in 1950 there.
This would be 1950. She gets pregnant in Mexico and has a baby. The first baby. You're the first.
I was born in a thatch roof hut with dirt floors, breech. Two midwives were the ones who brought me into the earth. I did not have a doctor.
And you never had a chance to meet the midwives or really talk to your mother about this, because we'll get to that point in the story, but she ultimately passes. Wow. I mean, and for our listeners, you can't see my mother today, but she's strikingly beautiful, put together extremely well, and you can hear no accent in her voice. And yet she was born, as she described, under a thatch roof with no floors in the building. And again, that's not an uncommon story that we hear from you, but it just speaks to the greatness of our country. I think that that's where you started. Okay, so I've talked too much already. Now you're growing. She has another child.
No, she does not. She comes. She gets sick after I am born. And
what's the disease?
The disease is tuberculosis. It was pretty prevalent in that era. And my dad realized that she was not going to get better in the jungles of Mexico. So he thinks he needs to bring her back to the United States. So they did. They traveled back to her homeland, back into Tennessee, into that rural area. He sees the coughing is not subsiding. The family's very concerned, and he starts to do some investigation. And he finds out that there is a place in Dallas, Texas, that has a good hospital for TB people. It was called Oak Lawn
Hospital.
And it was very close to an area in Dallas, which was called Little Mexico.
Which is right off of Harry Hines today.
He lived
in the
on the street.
Harwood District.
Yes. Carroll Street was the street he lived on. He got a job running a grocery store, because it was a Mexican area and there was lots of Mexicans in Little Mexico. And he also...
This is probably 1953, 54?
About 53. And he also got a preacher. He would go out and preach and talk to the people around him about God and Jesus.
So his wife's ill.
In the hospital.
In the hospital. He's working a job as a groceryman and preaching on weekends or at nights.
And trying to take care of this little girl named Naomi. And so he struggles through about a year. I had many caretakers, and that's my first memory, one of being cared for by someone that I didn't know that well.
Let's talk about that. So is it the community of Little Mexico that he circulates in that provided a bit of support at that time?
Yes. And I think that, I did get some help. I mean, I was being cared for by some of these different families, but they couldn't take on.
And you're 3 or 2 or 3 years old.
Yeah.
You're a little girl.
They could not take on more than just watching me. They couldn't take me in. One family I stayed with pretty prolonged. That were the Barnetts. I remember them. And, but in the meantime, my father is making friends in that community. And he meets a man that is a wonderful Christian, of course, and his name's Dan Heising.
Now, how did they meet?
My daddy was his mailman.
He was Grandpa Heising, who I know as Grandpa Heising. Dan Heising was the mailman for Little Mexico.
Yes.
So daily he drops by, he's dropping mail.
At the little store, and he finds out that my dad is trying to preach.
So he has a relationship with this Mexican man, Albert.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
And then he learns through that relationship that he's got a daughter.
Yeah. And he's trying to take care of the little girl and all this. So he, Dan starts to ruminate and think he was Mr. Heising was a very deep thinker. He was a wonderful, wonderful man, but he also would go and meditate and think on things and pray on things. And so he began to pray. And God said, I guess he said, go get the little girl.
So Daniel Heising is originally from North Dakota.
That's correct, Grand Forks.
He probably came to Texas in Dallas.
He came to San Antonio and fell in love with San Antonio. Sold watermelons from North Dakota to the San Antonians and loved the Hispanic culture. So
he's of German descent.
Mm-hmm.
Did he marry before he came, or did he marry when he got here?
He married before he got. She's also from North Dakota.
So Frances Heising and Daniel Heising together are married. They come to Texas. They start in San Antonio. They ultimately settle in Dallas. Dan gets a job as the postal agent for the area. And do they have any children at this point?
They have Gail, their only daughter.
Their only daughter. And then he strikes a relationship up, and he decides after prayer and meditation that he wants to bring in another family member.
That's correct. And it was just such a miracle because I finally found a home, because I had felt like I didn't know where I was going to end up.
You were probably 5 at this point.
I was 5 at that point. I couldn't speak English. I spoke only Spanish at this point. And so he takes me to this home, and my dad takes me to this home in an area around Fair Park. And
this is Oak Cliff.
Yes, Oak Cliff. Well, actually, it's South Dallas is what.
So he didn't live in Oak Cliff at the time.
No.
This is in South Dallas where he lives.
That's correct. And so
where he and Frances
and Gail live on Meyer Street in South Dallas, close to Fair Park. I went into this family without being able to speak English, and they totally embraced me. I did not have a diet that was worth anything. I had Coke and donuts for breakfast.
Coca-Cola and donuts, breakfast of champions.
But it was wonderful. And then when they started to say, no, you must eat some vegetables and some eggs and some strawberries, which I hated, and just anything, like I would sit at the table and gag because I had never tasted that kind of food. But anyway, slowly but surely, I began to like it all. My dad, Heising, as I said, was a very adventuresome character. And he would, we lived so close to Fair Park, we would walk to Fair Park and watch the Dr. Pepper show. And that's where I learned all about Dr. Pepper is the friendly picker-upper, and he'll never, never, never let you down. And so it was a wonderful period of my life, even though it was stressful. Mrs. Heising said that she would find me in a ball underneath the beds, and I would be wet because I'd wet my pants. And slowly but surely, the stress level must have gone down because I stopped wetting the bed.
So over the course of time, now your mother's passed by this time.
No, my mother was still alive.
Okay, so you're living with the Heisings. You're being raised by the Heisings, but Albert is still attending to your mom, and she's still ill.
Yes,
and getting worse.
But they decide at the hospital, Oak Lawn, that my mother was well enough at that time they were going to transfer all the patients from Oak Lawn to Parkland and close Oak Lawn. Apparently, the TB crisis was slowing down. So they were going to be able to do that. Well, my mother was very ill, but they let her go home for 3 months. And she lived with my dad in the Little Mexico area. And in that period of time, she got pregnant.
Pregnant again.
With my brother.
And then she's still sick, but not obviously well enough to go home.
Yeah.
And so he's probably thinking,
yay.
Well, yeah, we're going to be a family again. It's going to go back to normal. And so it makes sense to have another child. So she gets pregnant, but that's not to be.
That's not to be. She has to go back to the hospital.
The pregnancy probably takes a tremendous amount from her.
Tremendous toll. And that was when I was 5. But whenever I was 9, she finally passed.
Oh, so she passed at 9. So
when I was 9.
You've been raised from 5 to 9 at the Heisings, seeing them regularly, but not living at Albert's home. And she dies.
Yes, she dies.
How was that?
It was extremely painful because I had a dream about her dying. As a little girl, I always had a lot of anxiety, knowing that, she was precarious. And so I dreamt that I saw a cemetery, a beautiful lawn. It was right before she died. It was at least a few months before she died. And then she died.
Do you remember her at all?
Yes, I remember my mother, but mainly what I remember is seeing her from a distance. I don't remember her arms around me, her kisses, or any of that. What I remember is being in the parking lot of, I guess it was Oak Lawn, and looking up at her in her hospital room and waving to her and trying to hear what she was saying, because she was saying things out the window and trying to talk to me. But other than that, that's pretty much all I remember. So I didn't have a lot of nurturing.
As a mom now, and as a dad myself, I can't imagine her pain.
Yes, she was in agony, I'm sure.
I mean, to watch her children and know that she couldn't be with them, I mean, that must have been agonizing for her.
Yes, it was very, very sad for her.
What a tough several years. And so are you learning English? Are you in school?
I learned English so fast, and just like my father learned English. And so I also learned without an accent. My father, to the day he died, had an accent. I did not. And so I really enjoyed my time with the Heisings. So
they're in South Dallas, but they ultimately moved to Oak Cliff.
Yes. When I was 6, we moved to a big house on a street called Gibbs Williams Road in Oak Cliff.
Right over by Kimball High School.
Yes. And that's where my real memories began to really blossom. And I began to understand what was going on. I realized, even at an early age, I realized I came to America and I got to become an American. Mm. I did not want to change this land. I wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to be immersed in it. I did not want to I wanted a sense of belongingness in this land.
I hear that a lot. And I had a good conversation with a friend of mine from the RGV, and I was asking the question about why such a large percentage of that population embraced conservative Republicanism, particularly Trump, in this last election cycle. Mm-hmm. And his answer was similar to yours. The people that have come over from Mexico are often so grateful to be blessed in this land that they don't look back on it with great love
No.
like they do their adopted new homeland.
We decided that was over and this is our home.
This is your home. Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way. And this is a moment in our conversation that breaks conventional wisdom, because I think most people who might be listening that are non-Hispanic might think, oh, well, all Hispanics are Democrats and all Hispanics are progressives, and certainly there's no Republicans that like Trump, and that's just not true. I mean,
No.
the fact is a significant proportion of them do in certain regions of Texas. And we're hearing one of the stories today as to why and how that happened. So I think it's important.
I believe in God and country, and it was instilled in me from the time I started school, because I came into America in a time when I went to first grade, we said the Pledge of Allegiance first thing. The announcer would come on, the microphone would come on in the morning through all the classes of the school, and we would all stand together and we would say the Pledge of Allegiance. We would then have scripture, and then we would pray.
So you're growing up now in Oak Cliff. You're going to mostly Anglo schools in
Daniel Webster.
in DISD at the time. You don't speak with an accent, and you're half Anglo. So are you identified as Hispanic? Are you identified by others? I mean,
I don't know, because of the fact that the only time I ever felt that was one incident that I felt separated. But I was able to, I would say that I so wanted the sense of belongingness that I refused to believe there was anything different between me and them.
Mm.
And the only time I ever had to come to terms with it was when it was blatant, like little girls that were talking about me while I was in the stall in the toilet, and I could hear them saying, "And she wants to be so friendly to me, and I don't understand it. I don't get it." And I went, "Who are they talking about?"
Because they might have perceived you differently.
Exactly. And I never really understood their conversation. And I came out of the stall and it hurt for a moment, but I submerged it and said, I don't care. I don't care.
Well, again, for our listeners, my mother's very light skinned. She has very European features. And so it would be difficult to look at you and say, oh, you're clearly Hispanic. You have to think about it. You're beautiful like Eva Longoria, but even lighter skinned, right? And I think that's part of the story too. You're a striking beauty. You're turning heads, and somewhat exotic because you got the dark hair, the dark eyes. Mm-hmm. So I imagine that creates a little bit of a difference as you get into high school.
Well, the thing that happened when after my mother died, he then married several times, and within the marriages, I then felt different because I found people in the marriages. One woman had 7 children, and they absolutely despised me, hated me, and the reason why was because I didn't have an accent. I knew how to carry myself probably better, and there was a lot of jealousy. And I didn't understand it because my desire is to always embrace and help.
Isn't that a dichotomy that we face? And I had the same conversation with, I think it was Miguel Solis yesterday, or when we last did our podcast, that, from the Anglo perspective, we're not always accepted because we're not always like them. And that evidenced itself with those little girls. But from our own community, sometime if we do have characteristics that are Anglo-like, we're sometimes ostracized for that. I know growing up, I'm called an Oreo or a coconut. You're
Right.
brown on the outside, but white on the inside, and I don't belong anywhere.
Yes.
And that's something that I think we struggle with.
That is true.
Particularly lighter-skinned Hispanics.
Yeah. It was a very difficult time in my life during the growing up years.
So you're living with the Heisings on and off,
Mm-hmm.
because your father's, trying his best to be a good dad, and bring you back into the family as he remarries, but it doesn't work because you're so different. And you changed since the 5-year-old girl that he gave up to the time that you're now in high school and starting to become a woman.
Right.
Which brings me to your first job, or not maybe your first job, but one of your jobs at Minyard's food store.
Yes, I was I don't know how I became so ambitious, but I started out as a young woman in high school, and immediately I realized that the way to go anyplace was to get going. And so I started asking questions at the schools. What other opportunities are there? Can I go to any classes that would help me? And one of the things that was offered was called distributive education. And they would ask you to go and interview with people and see if you could get a job, and you would go to school half a day and the other half you would go to work. And so at 15, that is when I got the opportunity to do that. I went to several places with office work, but instead I ended up at Minyard's grocery store and enjoyed that.
You're a checker.
I was a checker. And I would go to school, and then I would come home and change and go be a checker. And in that environment, I was so blessed to meet my future husband.
Well, let's talk about that. So Pop is working as a young grocery man in the produce department, stocking produce as a 15, 16-year-old himself. I could bring him on too to talk about his life at that time. But from what I understand, he is at this point, like you, focused on work, probably less focused on school than he needs to be, hot rodding around in fast cars, and he spots this young checker. How'd y'all first meet?
Well, I was at the check stand, and to tell you the truth, I was already dating a young man from school, Johnny Edens, and I had never dated any Hispanics. And so I really didn't know their culture. I was uncomfortable with that, with the real deep Hispanic culture, because I'd been raised so much without that. So I was a little bit shaky on that, but he pursued me. He kept looking over there and looking over there at me as I checked. And then he came over there one time and he said, if you ever need a ride, I'll be happy to take you home, because I lived very close to him.
Well, wasn't that friendly of him?
Wasn't that nice? And so,
I'm sure out of the altruism of his heart, and not because
he wanted to take me home. So I had this Johnny Edens guy, and he would also want to take me home. So he would drive up there and pick me up in this big, horrible, honking green Oldsmobile, and I'd go with Johnny, and he'd take me home. Well, one day I saw what George drove, which was a Mustang, and it was beautiful and yellow and hot. And so I said to George, "You can take me home."
My dad, for people that don't know, is a bit of a gearhead, and he loves fast cars. He loves good-looking cars, and to this day, I know he loves cars, but he's told me that story as well, and he describes you as, of course, beautiful, but with legs that wouldn't stop.
Yeah.
He likes to say that. So that is a family story that I always like to hear when you guys met. So you meet, you let him drive you to your house, and because he's got a cool car and he's a nice guy. What do you think about George? Because he's not like the other people that you're probably with.
Well, it was just such a shock, because he came from such a different background that I had not been around. And he had, at that time, 8 little brothers and sisters. And he was the eldest.
And he's a good Catholic boy at this time.
He was a good Catholic boy. And so, of course, when we started dating, there was a lot of backlash from both sides of the family, because I was Protestant and he was Catholic. And so
which in the 1960s is a much bigger deal than it would be today.
Absolutely. So we kept on, we were kind of sneaky and, not a whole lot of knowledge from both sides of the families exactly that we were actually seeing each other as much as we were. But we just kept on, seeing each other. And he is such a gentle, kind man that I began to fall in love. And so he was just kind to me, and I appreciated that. And so we got serious. And then I found that I was pregnant.
So you're 16.
I was.
So you're 16 years old.
I was 17.
Oh, 17 years old.
No, wait a minute. I was 16.
When you get pregnant at 16, and that's obviously a surprise. Again, not something that is typically well accepted in the 1960s, but you're going to keep the baby.
Well, I wasn't feeling well. And so he told me, I said to him, I haven't had a period. And I said, I think we better go see a doctor because I'm not well. And so we went to the doctor together, 2 kids.
Yeah, you're 16 years old.
17. Well, by that time,
you're 17.
I met him when I was 16. I got pregnant when I was 17. Mm-hmm. I wasn't that bad. But anyway, I was 17. I'd had my birthday in February. And so I went ahead and actually I didn't even get pregnant till October of my 17th year, and he was 17. And so we went to the doctor. The doctor told me, "You are pregnant, ma'am." And I said, "Oh my goodness." And I just burst into tears and was very upset. But your father said, "It's going to be okay. We're going to get married. It's going to be fine."
He's a rock.
And he said, we want this baby. And I went, okay. So we went straight to the Heisings. And my mother Heising, who is a very strong woman, said, "You'll be married by Thursday." That was a Monday. We were married by Thursday.
And there's pictures of that in our house, that Thursday wedding. Everyone looks excited. You don't look as excited.
I was terrified.
And what about Albert, your father?
My father accepted it, but he had to take George out to the lake at North Lake when there was a North Lake, and he baptized him. And he was no longer Catholic after that moment. And then that started World War III.
With his family.
And so it was a very difficult time. They were very, very uncomfortable. But my mother-in-law, to her credit, she went with us to the judge, and my father and Mrs. Heising, Mr. Heising, we all went together. I sat in the back between the 2 mothers and cried my eyes out. And George was in the front with my dad and Grandpa Heising, and we all went, and I got married. We got married.
Your kid, 16 or 17 with child, and getting married.
1967. Everybody else was in the Cultural Revolution. We had seen the Russian Cold War under desks and being in the halls, and all that was going on in my youth. We had seen the space race, the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1963, the death of a president, Nikita Khrushchev hitting the desk. All these things were in my mind. The Vietnam War started right about that time.
So let's talk quickly about that, right? So Pop, George, my dad, is eligible. Wasn't drafted, but he signs up.
He does. We got married in 1967, and about 1970, he decides he wants to go.
He wants to be in the war.
And I was, again, very frustrated because I had 2 babies.
Well, you have 1 by then. I wasn't.
One baby.
I didn't come. I was probably. You're probably
71.
71, right?
Yeah, I had 1 baby, and he was going to go off and leave me in this little apartment in Oak Cliff, Texas, and I was not happy, And the thing that happened was remarkable. The guy from the Army, or what it was, I guess it was his, what are those called?
The recruiting
agent. He said, "Son, you need to go home to your wife.
And child.
And so George, as your announcer just said, my son, he is the rock, and he realized his responsibility.
Well, he comes home, and then I'm on the way.
Then you come.
Then I'm on the way. So this is 1971 now, and you're a family, and you're growing, and things are changing, and jobs are changing, and times are changing. I want to fast forward to a time in your life where you'd gone through a series of jobs, but you're unfulfilled. You got married younger than you wanted to. You had the world as your oyster, and probably disappointed that you didn't get to do the kinds of things that you were hoping to do, college and all those things.
My father was an old-fashioned guy and Hispanic, as you all know, and he thought it was really important for my brother to go to college, but not so important for me because I was pretty. And I was somewhat, resentful of that. And because I thought that I had just as much potential as my brother. Just because he was male, he was going to help him try to get into college. And so I then took off on my own course and realized I was going to have to do what I needed to do for me.
And you want to see the world.
I want to see the world. So I I walked up and down. I worked for Avis Rent-A-Car when I was very young. And I went to the airport. This is when my husband was traveling. He was already getting jobs in other cities. And so it was in San Antonio. And I walked up and down all the airline counters and said, I'm looking for a betterment. I'm an Avis Rent-A-Car agent, but I want to be a flight attendant. I want to work for an airline. And so I was stopped at Southwest, and Southwest said, we're not hiring. I stopped at American. I stopped at Delta. I got to Braniff, and Braniff said, yeah, we're hiring flight attendants, but the recruiting office is in Dallas, Texas. And I said, okay. And so they said, we'll have to fly you up there. And there was this man who was the one who said, I'll go with you. And unbeknownst to me, he was also quite a Lothario. So he brought me to Dallas, and I got my interview. I got hired. He takes me back to a hotel saying we have quite a bit of time before our flight leaves.
Oh, dear.
So I'm, taken aback, but I'm
you're young. You're not expecting.
I'm not expecting that.
Yeah.
It was 1976. And so I'm like, okay. And he literally tries to seduce me for over an hour until I finally say, this is not going to happen. Please take me back. And so finally we go back to the airport. It was a very uncomfortable ride back home on the airplane with this man. And then I get back home earlier than expected because I don't know what I had been told when my flight was going to get back, but my husband was not there because he didn't know. And I started taking off walking. I was so angry from the airport in San Antonio to my home. And, but finally I called and my husband came and picked me up. And that was my first encounter with Me Too,
Well, it happens all across the country. Every woman has a story like that. I have two daughters, as you know, your grandchildren, and I worry about that. In the 60s, or this would be the 70s now, it would be even more prevalent and less.
This was after the Cultural Revolution,
yeah, so
and they
everybody,
thought they could have sex with anybody.
Everybody thinks that's just the case, but
I'm going to be grateful or something.
Yeah, well, exactly, right. And here you are, you're trying to find a new life, or not a new life, but a new adventure.
I'm trying to do something for us.
To do something for your family. Mm-hmm. So you end up at Braniff, and again, I know I've told the listener several times how beautiful you are. Braniff only hired the most beautiful. That's what they're known for, was hiring the prettiest girls. And they had the Halston dresses. And I remember during that time, I'm a kid, so I don't know much of anything. I just thought you looked pretty when you were going out the door. And you saw the world.
I did.
How was that?
It was wonderful. And I got to bring my children along, you guys with me. And anytime that I had the opportunity that it was a flight that you guys could come, and I knew that there would be a good hotel for you to get in a swimming pool or whatever, I got to take you with me, and I enjoyed that so much. And of course, Braniff was, going to Hawaii.
We went to Hawaii as
we
a
all
family.
went to
And
Hawaii.
that was fun.
And I thought, I wanted you all to have that opportunity. I wanted both of you and Andy both to be able to really do well as young Hispanic children. And so anytime I had the opportunity, we could travel, we traveled.
And we saw a lot. As a kid growing up, of course, I miss you desperately when you're gone, but I think that experience also expanded my horizons in the sense that I could see parts of the country and even the world and got to see more than a provincial life of a young Hispanic kid in Dallas, Texas. So I appreciate that, so you do that. But then there's some hard times, right? You
There's
face
some hard times.
some of the things when you're a kid kind of come back.
They do. After I get pregnant again, I was my third pregnancy. I began to, I'm on my way to Albany, New York, and I began to miscarriage on the flight. And that throws me into a really serious physical confusion. I was hormonal and lots of different things happened. Anxiety levels that I'd had when I was a little child began to arise in me again. And I would touch the airplane and I would feel my heart just kind of like jumping out of my chest. And I didn't understand. It was simply anxiety. I thought, truthfully, I was having a heart attack. And so I went to see a cardiologist and I went to see, and he said, different doctors, he would send me, nothing was wrong with me except for my hormonal switching from being pregnant to not being pregnant all of a sudden. So I had a depression, a serious depression, and I had to leave work and be in a hospital for a while.
So anxiety and depression take control.
Yes.
This is at a time when people have less understanding about it. Mm-hmm. So, we know now it's chemical, largely imbalances, and you can medicate it. But there are also some issues that you're dealing with from your youth that are.
I had to go through the reaction of finally grieving the death of my mother, because when you're 9, you really don't grasp it as well. And so I didn't understand, that I still had lots to grieve, especially after the loss of that child. The baby was 4 months old when I lost it. And they couldn't tell the sex, of course, not yet, but because in those days they didn't have the things they have now. But nevertheless, the entire experience was stressful. And I tried to keep going and ignore the depression and anxiety. Even went to take my family, my entire family. I took my mother and my dad, my foster parents, and my children to Washington, D.C. And we had a really good time. But at the end of it, President Reagan is shot.
Right. I remember being there.
And we were all there, and it was so stressful. And it was all night long news at that time. Finally, we're at the stage in America where there's news all night long. And I'm a news hound to begin with. So I began to watch it all night long. And you talk about ratcheting up the anxiety. It did that. So when I came back home, I realized I was in trouble. And that is when I began to search out, again, help, started going to counseling, and still could not get the sleeping corrected. And that's when I finally had to be hospitalized. That finally was the answer. But in those days, I could have been nowadays, I could have been given an antidepressant and been medicated, and I've been fine. But in those days, they still didn't understand as much as they do now. So I had to first get some sleep. So they gave me some medicine to sleep. And within 3 weeks, I was able to function again.
Consistently in your life, and I'm hearing this over and over, and I've always known this, but you're overcoming adversity after adversity after adversity, and you're doing it with strength and resolve that I think is compelling. And I think it speaks to who you are, number one, but who we are as a people.
Yeah.
Right. Latinos in Texas, look, it's not always an easy ride.
Yeah.
We do have things that we have to face, and we do have stories that aren't always like our Anglo neighbors and brothers and sisters. But yet it's I like to point out unifying themes of our culture, and one of them I think is the strength, particularly of our females, our women. Our women are very strong in our culture, and I think that plays itself out in your life over and over again. So let's fast forward to your work after that. You stayed in the airline industry, worked for Southwest Airlines
and then after Braniff, and they went under, and in those few years in between, I floundered because I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew that I was an airline person. And so when one of my girlfriends who was a flight attendant with me, she said, "Hey, I'm working at Southwest now. Would you like to see if there's anything for you there?" And I said, "Are you kidding?" And so I went and I interviewed with the most powerful woman in this company. Her name was Colleen Barrett. And I'm, this cheeky little Mexican girl, I guess, because I said to her, she was interviewing me, and I had been I was a dental assistant. I was just different little jobs I had in between there, but I knew that it wasn't enough money. So I said, when I got in there with her, I said, "I'll come, but I won't come for anything less than $1,200 a month." I thought I was a big shot. And now when I look back on it, I think, who did I think I was? I was talking to Colleen Barrett.
Yeah.
And I was telling her what I would take.
And for our listeners, Colleen Barrett is Chairman Emeritus of the Board of Directors of Southwest Airlines. She was president for a period of time. She was essentially the number one at Southwest after Herb passed, and then was a big player of Southwest and really built the airline from day one, starting in the 70s. So, she is a part of our family. I know when I was growing up, I remember her present, her and Herb, regularly, and that's the story of that, which I think is fascinating.
So then I was hired, and I worked for this extremely tough woman who would not accept anything but excellence. And I think I had the underpinnings for that, but I was nowhere near what she expected. So it was almost 20 years of being in college with Colleen Barrett. And with that, her whipping me into shape, if you'll pardon that, but it was, she taught me how to file, she sent me to executive secretarial school. So I learned grammar, I learned writing, I learned dictaphone in those days. That's what we had in those days. And so I could sit down at a typewriter and listen to her tapes and type out what she needed. And, there were many that were better than me, but as time went on, I got pretty good.
Well, working for Colleen is going to make you sharp. I mean, that's living in the fire. She's obviously one of the most impactful women in Texas history of a business, no, unquestionably. Exactly. And you got a chance to be to work with her for 20 years before you retired. At the same time, I guess Pop leaves the grocery business, learns from his gearhead days how to fix not only cars but airplanes, and ends up working at Southwest Airlines as an airplane mechanic.
That's correct.
So he's doing that. I want to hit one more subject, and then we'll close it down. And that is, I think, the biggest tragedy in your life, certainly in our family's life, and that's Andrea. Andrea was born back in 68. 68, that was what started this family, right? When Andrea came along, and she was also at Southwest, and she gets sick.
She was also beautiful.
Yeah, she was. So she gets sick.
She does. And watching her the year that, I can't help but my voice changes, but the year that she began to die
was lung cancer.
And it was so horrible when her husband and her came in from going to the doctor, and her being told that she was in stage 4 lung cancer. And I remember that after they left, her and Jack, I went to the sink and just wept so hard. And my husband came and put his arm around me and again said, "It's going to be okay. We're going to be all right." But it wasn't all right for that year. And we both would just cry, and I would lay on the floor of my room. I have a guest room in my house, and just weep and lay my body out and beg God, please don't take her. And we would have some ups where we'd feel like maybe the disease was being fought back some, and we'd have her longer. But then the bad news would come again. And so finally, the last day, and through it all, she became my hero because she was strong.
Stronger than all of us.
Stronger than all of us, and decided that, she knew what was happening, but yet she was going to go ahead and go out fairly well. And she was kind of like she had removed her mind from her body. It was almost like that to me. But anyway, a couple of times she would call me in and say, Mother, look at this or look at that on my body. And I was always trying to not be so shocked by the things that were happening. But the last day she tells us, I want to go to church. And so I said, you do? And she said, yes. So me and Jack got her ready, and we went to the church, and she drug herself up by the railings into the church. Once she sat down, she could never settle down, and she couldn't breathe. So finally, we all got up and we left. And we came home to her house. And Jack said, we're going to have to take her to the hospital because he could see she could no longer breathe. And so I called my husband and said, come get Samuel, Margaret, her son. And he did. And I said, you watch Samuel, we're going to the hospital. And we came in front of my son's house, Jason's house.
The person you're talking to.
And he said, what do I do? I said, come with us.
And I remember I'm taking the Christmas lights down and you drive up, and I knew Andrea was sick. I didn't know what that meant to get ready to go, but I knew something needed to be done. And so I dropped everything and we went to the hospital that day, and we spent the day with her. And I don't think either of us thought that was the day.
I thought they would be able to do something to delay it, but the color of her skin and the color of her body was just so gray. And then I was in the room with her, and I don't know if you were there, but I was in the room when they stuck in the needle deep into her lungs to try to run off some fluid, and it did not help. And that's when I began to know. And so then we went up to the room, but I went in there and helped her undress and get her situated, and she was gasping. And I remember saying, I am going to be here. And she said, I want you to go home.
She wanted all of us to leave.
All of us to leave. And I did not want to leave. And so finally the nurse convinced me, because she said, if that's what she wants, you need to go. And it was heartbreaking because I wanted to be there every last moment. But I went home. And right as I'm getting in the house, my son, Jason, drive up and said, she's gone.
Yeah.
And I fell in the front yard. And my world was forever changed. And we went back, and I was able to crawl into bed with her and hug her. She was still warm. And she was just gone. But because I am a Christian, I know I'll see her again. And I live for the day that I can put my arms around her and hold her again. And that's my story. And since then, I've taken on her son and raised him because of my loyalty to my daughter. And I would do anything because I loved her so much. And he's almost grown. And I talked to his psychiatrist today because he had a lot of issues.
Sure.
And the psychiatrist said to me, you have done a great job.
Again, another example of your life where tragedy strikes. And this time right at the heart, and you overcome it. And we're never the same. People say that, time heals all wounds. Well, it may heal the open wound, but there's always a scar that's left. And we're of course scarred that Andrea's gone, but I think we're going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to be, you are okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a while now. It's been over
9 years.
It's been 9 years, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I know you do. But we're okay.
Mm-hmm.
We're okay. We're resilient.
We have a lot of rubber bands. We have a lot of bandwidth. I don't know how that happened. And I asked the Lord, because I'm a Christian, did you do this, or where did this come from? Thank you. Thank you so much that you keep bouncing back. And so far I have been, and so has my family. And I watch each one of you. I watch you, and I watch your dad, and I'm so proud of you and what you've accomplished in your life.
Well, it's obviously a testament to you and what you've done. I think your story, again, I started this conversation by saying it was fascinating. There's joy, and there's sadness,
Mm-hmm.
and there's hope, and there's inspiration in all of it. I always like to say that there's more beauty than sadness in the world. And I think this is a good example, but I think your story is one, and obviously I'm your son, so I'm biased, but I think when people hear this, I think they're going to see a lot of themselves in it, and a lot of their history. So thank you, Mom. I love you. I'm almost tearing up myself. It's just it's big to take. Hard to take sometimes to listen to those stories, but hearing it from you is great. And I appreciate that. So God bless. Thank you. Join us next week on Our Story. I'm Jason Villalba, your host. Look forward to seeing you soon around or on Our Story.
The Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation would like to thank you for joining us today on Our Story. You can find more information about the foundation at www.txhpf.org, on Facebook on the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation page, or on Twitter @TexHPF. Please join us next week on Our Story, a podcast dedicated to the voices of Texas Hispanics.